Have you ever stopped to wonder what really makes old age something to fear? Is it the wrinkles that carve their way into your skin, the gray hairs that sneak up overnight, or something deeper, something that creeps into your soul and steals the light from your eyes? For Eleanor Thompson, a 72-year-old retired elementary school teacher from a quiet suburb in Ohio, it wasn't just the passing of time that weighed her down. It was the slow, silent unraveling of everything that once made her life worth living. Experts say there are six pillars that can turn old age from a blessing into a nightmare if they slip away: physical health, mental sharpness, social connections, a sense of purpose, financial independence, and a thriving mind. Eleanor's story proves they're right. And trust me, by the time you hear what she's been through, you'll be asking yourself, could this happen to me? Or someone I love? Picture this: a small, two-story house on Maple Street, its white paint peeling like an old memory fading into dust. The front yard, once alive with daffodils Eleanor planted with her students during spring projects, now sits overgrown, choked with weeds. Inside, the air feels heavy, stale, like time itself has forgotten to move on. Eleanor sits in her faded armchair by the window, her gray curls spilling over her shoulders, staring out at a world that seems to have left her behind. The glass is smudged with dust, a thin film she hasn't bothered to wipe away in months. Why would she? No one comes to visit anymore. The kids she raised are busy with their own lives. Mark in California, Lisa in New York, and her husband, Tom, has been gone for 5 years now, taken by a heart attack that still feels like yesterday. Eleanor wasn't always like this. Back in her teaching days, she was a force of nature. Kids at Lincoln Elementary called her Mrs. T, the teacher who could turn a rainy recess into a storytelling adventure, who'd pull out her guitar and have the whole class singing about the planets or the pioneers. She had a laugh that filled the room, a spark that made you believe anything was possible. Parents would stop her in the grocery store, thanking her for inspiring their kids to dream big. But that was then. Now, the guitar sits untouched in the corner, its strings rusted, its wood gathering cobwebs. The woman who once lit up classrooms can barely muster the energy to light up her own day. It started small, the way erosion wears down a mountain quietly, unnoticed. After Tom passed, Eleanor told herself she'd be fine. She had her pension, her books, her memories. But the days stretched into weeks, then months, then years, and the cracks began to show. Her knees ache when she walks too long, a dull throb that keeps her from the garden she used to love. Her mind, once sharp enough to juggle lesson plans and parent meetings, now forgets where she parked her car or if she even drove it that day. The phone rarely rings, and when it does, it's usually a telemarketer, not a friend. Her savings, carefully tucked away for retirement, dwindle faster than she'd planned, eaten up by rising bills and a roof that leaks every spring. This morning was no different. Eleanor woke up to the same silence that greets her every day, the kind that presses against your chest until it hurts to breathe. She shuffled to the kitchen in her worn slippers, the floor cold against her feet, and made a cup of instant coffee black. No sugar, because who's she trying to impress? The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should, each second a reminder of how empty the house feels. She caught her reflection in the microwave door, tired eyes, sagging cheeks, a stranger staring back. Who am I now? She whispered to no one. It wasn't just a question, it was a plea. Experts will tell you this isn't rare. Studies from the National Institute on Aging show that nearly 40% of seniors in the U.S. report feeling lonely, and that's just the ones who admit it. Loneliness isn't just a feeling, it's a killer, raising your risk of heart disease, depression, even dementia. Add to that a body that won't cooperate, a mind that starts to slip, and a bank account that's shrinking, and you've got a recipe for misery. Eleanor didn't need a study to tell her that. She feels it in her bones, in the way her hands tremble when she tries to button her coat, in the way she can't remember the last time she laughed. But it's not just the loneliness that haunts her. It's the absence of purpose. Teaching gave her that a reason to get up, to plan, to care. Without it, the days blur together, a gray fog with no beginning or end. She used to dream of traveling after retirement, maybe writing a book about her years in the classroom. Now, she can't even muster the will to dust the shelves. And then there's the money. Tom always handled the finances, and Eleanor trusted him. But with him gone and no steady income beyond her pension, every unexpected expense feels like a punch to the gut. So here she is, 72 years old, sitting by a dusty window in a house that echoes with silence, wondering where it all went wrong. 6 things: physical health, mental sharpness, social connections, purpose, financial independence, a thriving mind. The experts say you need them to age well. The seniors who've lived it, like Eleanor, will tell you losing them is a slow descent into a life you wouldn't wish on anyone. But is this the end of her story? Or just the beginning of something no one saw coming? What about you? Have you ever thought about what keeps old age from turning into a shadow of what life could be? Stick around, because Eleanor's journey is about to take a turn, one that might just change the way you see everything. Eleanor Thompson used to think she could outrun time. She'd tell herself, "I've got years left to figure this out." But at 72, sitting alone in her quiet Ohio home, she's starting to see the truth. Time doesn't wait, and neither does the slow unraveling of a life once so full. The experts warned her, or at least, they warned people like her. Old age without 6 key things: physical health, mental sharpness, social connections, purpose, financial independence, and a thriving mind turns into a kind of misery you can't just wish away. Eleanor didn't read those studies back then. She didn't need to. Now, she's living them, one aching step, one forgotten memory, one silent day at a time. And if you're watching this, I've got a question for you. What would you do if you woke up one day and realized you'd lost what matters most? Let's rewind a little. A year ago, Eleanor noticed her body wasn't what it used to be. She'd try to climb the stairs to her bedroom, gripping the banister like a lifeline, only to stop halfway, her knees screaming in protest. "Just arthritis," she'd mutter, brushing it off. But it wasn't just that. She stopped walking to the park, stopped tending her garden, stopped moving. The National Institutes of Health says even moderate physical activity can cut your risk of chronic disease by 20%, but Eleanor's days are a testament to what happens when you let that slip away. Her legs feel like lead now, and the stiffness creeps into her hands, making it hard to hold a cup without spilling. She stares at the coffee stains on her kitchen counter sometimes, too tired to wipe them up, wondering when her body became her enemy. Then there's her mind. Eleanor used to pride herself on her memory names of every student, lyrics to every song she taught, the smell of chalk dust on a Monday morning. Now, she'll walk into a room and stand there, blank, trying to remember why she came in. Last week, she found her keys in the fridge next to the milk. She laughed at first, a shaky chuckle, but then the tears came. She hasn't picked up a book in months. Her shelves, once stuffed with novels and teaching guides, sit untouched, gathering dust like relics of a life she doesn't recognize. Research from the Alzheimer's Association says keeping your brain active can delay cognitive decline, but Eleanor's mind feels like it's shutting down, one foggy day at a time. And the silence, oh, the silence is the worst. Her phone hasn't rung with a friend's voice in over a year. Back in her teaching days, her house was a revolving door of laughter, colleagues dropping by for coffee, students' parents with thank you cards, Tom strumming his guitar while she cooked. Now, the only sound is the ticking clock and the occasional creak of the floorboards. She read somewhere a magazine in the doctor's office. Maybe that social isolation increases your risk of death by 29%, according to the World Health Organization. She didn't believe it then. She does now. Her kids call once a month, rushed voices over the line, promising visits that never come. Mark's got his tech job in Silicon Valley, Lisa's chasing her art dreams in Brooklyn. Eleanor doesn't blame them. She just misses them. She misses everyone. Hey, if you're still with me, let's make this a little interactive. Drop a 2 in the comments below to let me know you're here, or better yet, tell me, which of these 6 things: physical health, mental sharpness, social connections, purpose, financial independence, a thriving mind do you think matters most for a happy old age? I'd love to hear your thoughts while we dive deeper into Eleanor's story. Because it gets heavier. Tom's death 5 years ago didn't just take her husband, it took her anchor. He handled the bills, the taxes, the little emergencies like a cracked pipe or a blown fuse. Now, Eleanor's pension barely covers the basics. Last month, the water heater broke, and the repair bill wiped out half her savings. She stares at the numbers in her checkbook sometimes, her hands shaking, knowing she can't ask her kids for help, they've got their own struggles. Financial independence? That's a dream slipping through her fingers, one leaky roof at a time. She used to joke with Tom about retiring to Florida, sipping lemonade on a porch swing. Now, she can't even afford to fix the porch she's got. Purpose, though, that's the one that cuts deepest. Teaching gave her a reason to wake up, a fire that burned bright even on the toughest days. She'd spend hours crafting lessons, dreaming up ways to make fractions fun or history come alive. Her students were her world, and when she retired, she thought she'd find something else to fill that space. She didn't. The elementary school replaced her with a younger teacher, the kids grew up, and Eleanor faded into the background. She tried volunteering once, but her knees gave out halfway through the day, and she never went back. What's the point? She wonders, when no one needs her anymore. One night last week, she sat in her armchair, the same one by the dusty window, and let the darkness settle around her. The TV flickered in the corner, some late-night infomercial she wasn't really watching. She thought about the woman she used to be, Mrs. T, the spark, the heart of Lincoln Elementary, and felt a sob claw its way up her throat. "I'm disappearing," she whispered to the empty room. The clock ticked back, indifferent. She didn't sleep that night. She just sat there, replaying every moment she'd let slip away, every piece of herself she'd lost. 6 things. Physical health, gone to the ache in her joints. Mental sharpness, fading with every forgotten key. Social connections, severed by time and distance. Purpose, buried with her teaching days. Financial independence, crumbling under bills she can't pay. A thriving mind, dulled by the weight of it all. The experts say losing even one can tip the scales toward misery. Eleanor's lost them all. But is this really the end? Or is there a crack of light she hasn't seen yet? Stick with me, because Eleanor's about to face a moment that could change everything, and it's one you won't see coming. Eleanor Thompson was sinking. At 72, in her quiet Ohio home, the weight of a life stripped bare of its joy had finally pinned her down. The experts say old age without 6 things: physical health, mental sharpness, social connections, purpose, financial independence, and a thriving mind is a recipe for misery. Eleanor wasn't just missing 1 or 2. She'd lost them all, and it was dragging her into a darkness she didn't know how to escape. Have you ever felt like you're disappearing, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to hold on to? That's where Eleanor was teetering on the edge of giving up. But sometimes, when you're at your lowest, life throws you something so small, so unexpected, it cracks the door open just enough to let the light in. And that's exactly what happened. It started with a night she'll never forget, not because it was special, but because it was the bottom. The house was dark, the kind of dark that feels alive, pressing against her skin. Eleanor sat in her armchair, the one by the dusty window, staring at nothing. The TV was off, the clocks ticking, her only companion. She hadn't eaten all day, her stomach growled, but she didn't care. Her knees ached from sitting too long. Her hands trembled from the cold she couldn't shake. She hadn't left the house in a week, hadn't spoken to another soul in longer. The silence wasn't just outside her, it was inside, a hollow echo where her laughter used to live. She closed her eyes and saw flashes of her old life. Tom's grin, her students' cheers, the smell of crayons and fresh-cut grass. Then she opened them, and it was gone. All of it. "I'm done," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry leaves. Tears slid down her cheeks, hot and unstoppable, soaking into the worn fabric of her sweater. She didn't wipe them away. What was the point? Her body was failing. Those stairs might as well be Everest now. Her mind was a fog. She couldn't even name the last book she'd read. Her friends were ghosts. Her kids were strangers. Her savings were a ticking clock counting down to nothing. And purpose? That word felt like a cruel joke. The woman who'd once inspired hundreds of kids to dream couldn't inspire herself to get out of this chair. A study from the McKinsey Health Institute flickered through her memory, something she'd heard on the radio. Purpose and social connections are key to healthy aging. She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Too late for that," she muttered. That night, she didn't sleep. She cried until her throat burned, until her chest felt like it might cave in. She thought about Tom, about how he'd hold her hand and tell her everything would be okay. She thought about her students, their wide eyes and gap-toothed smiles, and how they'd moved on without her. She thought about the pills in the bathroom cabinet, not seriously, not yet, but the idea lingered, a shadow in the corner of her mind. Depression had crept in months ago, a quiet thief stealing what little fight she had left. The National Institute of Mental Health says untreated mental health issues in seniors double the risk of chronic illness. Eleanor didn't need the stats. She felt it, every breath heavier, every day darker. Morning came, gray and indifferent. Eleanor stayed in that chair, the dust on the window glowing faintly in the weak light. She hadn't moved, hadn't eaten, hadn't even turned on a lamp. The house smelled of neglect, stale coffee, unwashed laundry time. She was spiraling, and she knew it. But then knock, knock, knock. A sharp rap on the door jolted her, her heart thudding in her chest. She froze. No one knocked on her door anymore. Telemarketers didn't walk up to your porch. Her kids would have called first. She waited, hoping it was a mistake, but it came again, knock, 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 insistent, almost impatient. "Mrs. T, you in there?" A small voice, high-pitched and uncertain, cut through the silence. Eleanor blinked, her mind sluggish. Mrs. T? No one had called her that in years. She dragged herself up, her knees protesting with every step, and shuffled to the door. Her hand hesitated on the knob. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to crawl back to her chair and let the world fade away. But something, some flicker of the old Eleanor, made her turn it. Standing there was a boy, maybe 10 years old, with messy brown hair and a dirt-streaked face. He held a beat-up bicycle, its chain dangling like a broken promise. "Mrs. T, my chain's busted," he said, kicking at the porch with a scuffed sneaker. "Grandpa said you used to fix stuff for kids. Can you help?" Eleanor stared at him, her mouth dry. "Grandpa?" She squinted, and then it hit her, those hazel eyes, that stubborn jaw. He looked like Tommy Grayson, one of her first students, a wiry kid who'd built a birdhouse in her class 30 years ago. "Tommy's your grandpa?" She croaked, her voice rusty from disuse. The boy nodded. "Yeah, he says you're the best teacher he ever had." Eleanor's breath caught. The best teacher. The words pierced through the fog, sharp and sudden, like a memory she'd buried too deep. She glanced at the bike, then back at the boy. Jake, he said his name was. Her hands shook, but she nodded. "Bring it to the garage," she said, surprising herself. He grinned, gap-toothed and bright, and wheeled the bike around back. In the garage, Eleanor fumbled with Tom's old toolbox, her fingers clumsy but determined. The chain was a mess, but she remembered how Tom had taught her years ago, laughing as she cursed the grease. Jake chattered nonstop about school, his dog, how Grandpa still talked about her storytime lessons. Eleanor listened, her chest loosening just a little. For the first time in months, she wasn't alone. For the first time in months, someone needed her. As Jake pedaled off, shouting a thank you over his shoulder, Eleanor stood in the driveway, grease on her hands, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She looked at the house, at the life she'd let slip away, and asked herself, could I get it back? Any of it? The 6 things she'd lost: health, sharpness, connections, purpose, money. A thriving mind felt so far gone. But that boy, that bike, that spark, maybe it wasn't over. What do you think? Could a moment like that pull you out of the dark? Because Eleanor's about to find out, and it's going to change everything. Eleanor Thompson stood in her driveway, grease still smeared on her hands, watching little Jake pedal away on his newly fixed bike. At 72, she'd thought her story was over, buried under the weight of a life stripped of physical health, mental sharpness, social connections, purpose, financial independence, and a thriving mind. The experts say losing those 6 things turns old age into a nightmare, and Eleanor had been living proof. But that day, something shifted. A crack of light broke through the darkness, and she grabbed it with both hands. What she did next wasn't just a comeback, it was a rebirth. And by the end of this, you might just ask yourself, what could I do to make sure my golden years shine instead of fade? It started with that bike. Jake's visit wasn't a one-off. The next day, he was back, this time with a book, a beat-up copy of Charlotte's Web, asking if she'd read it with him. "Grandpa says you're the best storyteller," he said, plopping down on her porch steps. Eleanor hesitated, her voice rusty, her mind foggy. But she took the book, sat beside him, and started reading. Her words stumbled at first, but then they flowed, her old teacher's magic flickering back to life. Jake's eyes lit up, just like her students used to, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt at purpose. That spark she'd lost when she retired, the one that made her leap out of bed each morning, was glowing again. She didn't stop there. She told Jake to come back tomorrow, and he did, bringing a friend this time. Word spread. Soon, Eleanor's porch was a tiny hub of kids, all clutching books or broken toys, begging for Mrs. T to fix or read or just talk. She dusted off her guitar, her fingers stiff but willing, and taught them songs about the stars. Her mind, dulled by months of neglect, began to hum again, names, stories, melodies snapping into focus. The Alzheimer's Association says engaging your brain can cut dementia risk by 30%, and Eleanor could feel it. Every page she read, every chord she strummed, was like waking up a piece of herself she'd let sleep too long. Purpose and a thriving mind, two of the six, were hers again, and she wasn't letting go. But she didn't stop at her porch. One morning, she laced up her old sneakers, ignoring the ache in her knees, and walked to the park. It was slow, 10 steps, a pause, 10 more, but she kept going. She found a group of seniors there, gray-haired strangers stretching under the oaks, and joined them. "I'm Eleanor," she said, her voice shaky but firm. They welcomed her, and soon she was walking with them every day, swapping stories about grandkids and gardens. Her legs grew stronger, the stiffness easing bit by bit. The CDC says even light activity can slash chronic disease risk by 20%, and Eleanor felt every percentage point in her bones. Physical health and social connections numbers 3 and 4 slid back into her life, one step, one smile at a time. Money was trickier. Her pension was still tight, and the roof still leaked. But those kids on her porch gave her an idea. She started a little repair gig: bikes, skateboards, even a dollhouse, once charging a few bucks here and there. It wasn't much, but it patched the holes in her budget. Then one of the park's seniors, a retired accountant named Ruth, offered to help her sort her finances. "You're sitting on a gold mine of experience," Ruth said, eyeing Eleanor's teaching stories. Together, they brainstormed. Eleanor could tutor online, sharing her lessons with kids across the country. She set up a shaky webcam, recorded her first reading session, and posted it. To her shock, it took off. Parents subscribed, donations trickled in. Financial independence, number 5, wasn't a dream anymore, it was a reality she'd built herself. The last piece, mental health, took the most courage. Eleanor knew the darkness she'd faced wasn't gone, it lingered, waiting for weak moments. So she called a hotline one night, voice trembling, and booked a session with a therapist. "I'm 72, she told the woman on the phone. "Is it too late?" The answer was no. Talking helped, unpacking Tom's death, her kids' distance, her fears. She learned to breathe again, to let the tears come without drowning in them. The National Institute of Mental Health says therapy can have depression symptoms in seniors, and Eleanor proved it, one session at a time. Number 6, mental health, was hers again. Months later, Eleanor stood in that same park, not just walking but leading. She'd started a group, Silver Expertise, she called it, where seniors shared skills with kids: knitting, woodworking, storytelling. The local paper wrote about it. Retired teacher turns suburb into classroom. Her porch buzzed with laughter, her phone rang with friends, her bank account held steady. She'd taken those 6 things the experts swore by and made them her own. One day, Jake ran up, grinning, and handed her a drawing. Mrs. T with a cape, surrounded by kids. "You're a superhero," he said. Eleanor laughed, really laughed, the sound ringing through the trees, and for the first time in years, she believed it. She sat on her porch that night, guitar in her lap, watching the sunset paint the sky gold. The house wasn't silent anymore, it hummed with life. She thought about the Eleanor from a year ago, the one who'd nearly vanished in that armchair, and marveled at how far she'd come. "It's never too late," she whispered, strumming a soft chord. The studies backed her up, the CDC, the NIH, McKinsey, they all say small changes can rewrite your old age. But Eleanor didn't need their numbers. She'd lived it. So here's the question for you. What's your plan? Will you let those 6 things, physical health, mental sharpness, social connections, purpose, financial independence, a thriving mind, slip away, or will you fight for them like Eleanor did? She was 72 when she started over. How old are you today? And what's stopping you from making your golden years glow? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments. Maybe it's a story about someone you know, or a step you're taking for yourself. Because if Eleanor can rise from the ashes, so can you or someone you love. Let's keep this fire burning together.